She had 72 hours to accept a deal that would save her mother's life, offered by the one man in New York whose name made entire boardrooms go silent. Nora Ellis had never planned on meeting Kang Jae-won. She had certainly never planned on needing him, but the letter from Mercy General sat on her kitchen counter like a stone, and the number at the bottom had too many digits to pretend away, and the man her former partner had become was currently ensuring that no firm in the city would return her calls. So when Jae-won's chief of staff appeared at the coffee shop where Nora was nursing her third cup and her last shred of dignity, sliding a cream envelope across the table with the J Group seal pressed into the wax, Nora didn't throw it away. She opened it, and her life divided cleanly and permanently into before and after. 2 years earlier, Nora had been exactly where she was supposed to be, junior partner at Ellis Holt Architecture, her name on the glass, her designs on 3 buildings currently reshaping the Brooklyn waterfront. She had earned every square inch of that office with 7 years of 70-hour weeks, with drawings that made senior partners pause mid-sentence and look twice, with a precision that her colleagues called unsettling and her clients called extraordinary. Then came the accident. A cab. A wet intersection. The kind of Tuesday afternoon that looks completely ordinary right up until it doesn't. The impact had been moderate. 2 cracked ribs, a concussion, a laceration along her left temple that healed into a scar she'd learned to stop noticing. But the damage to the delicate structures of her inner left ear had been, as the specialist explained with clinical gentleness, permanent. Partial hearing loss. Not total, not even severe by clinical standards. She could still work, still speak, still sit in a meeting and follow every word spoken on her right side without difficulty. But Marcus Holt had decided that partial was enough. She found out the way people always find out about the things done behind their backs. By accident. An email intended for his assistant, forwarded to her by mistake, 3 paragraphs discussing how her condition presented a reputational risk, how clients noticed that she sometimes asked them to repeat themselves, how in high-stakes presentations the optics were becoming a concern. Nora had read the email 4 times, then she'd printed it, placed it in a manila folder, and walked into Marcus's office. He hadn't apologized, he'd explained. There was a difference, she had learned, and it was a distinction that revealed everything necessary about a person's character. Within 6 weeks, she was out. The settlement was tidy and quiet, and designed to keep her from saying anything publicly that might cause discomfort. She signed it because her mother had been diagnosed that same month, a cardiac condition requiring a procedure that insurance covered partially and reality covered not at all. The number was specific and merciless, $240,000, and the window for the surgery was closing with the patience of a man who had somewhere better to be. Nora had spent 8 months trying every legitimate avenue. Loans declined. Investors uninterested. Freelance work that paid decently, but nowhere near enough. And Marcus, who had once called her the best design mind he'd worked with, had spent those same 8 months making quiet calls to quiet people, ensuring that her resume was received with a particular kind of hesitation. She wasn't broken. She needed to be clear about that, even if only to herself in the early mornings when the apartment felt too quiet, and the letter from Mercy General had already been read too many times to surprise her anymore. She was not broken. She was cornered. And those were entirely different things. She was still holding that distinction carefully when she opened the envelope. The letter was brief. Kang Jae-won did not use unnecessary words. She would learn this about him. But the letter was the first indication. 3 short paragraphs. An acknowledgement that he was aware of her work, specifically the Sable Pier renovation that had earned her firm an award she never got credit for. A statement that he had a project, a time, a place, and a single line at the bottom that she read 3 times. I am told you are no longer with Ellis Holt. That is, for my purposes, convenient. The meeting was at 7 the following morning. The address was Midtown. The implication was that she would come, and that it would not be discussed further until she did. She came. The J Group occupied the top 4 floors of a building that Nora, despite everything, stopped to look at from the sidewalk. It was good architecture, clean, restrained, confident in its proportions, the kind of building that didn't need to announce itself because its presence was already undeniable. She filed that away and walked through the glass doors. The lobby was the quietest she'd ever stood in, not the aggressive, performed quiet of spaces trying to seem important. Something else. A functional stillness. The kind that suggested that everything happening here happened efficiently and that inefficiency would be noticed and corrected without drama. The receptionist smiled. A woman in charcoal approached before Nora had finished giving her name. "Ms. Ellis." Not a question. "I'm Seo Yuna, Mr. Kang's chief of staff. He's expecting you." She moved the way the building felt. Purposeful. Economical. No motion wasted. Nora followed her into an elevator that opened directly into a conference room on the 41st floor, and she was given water and a chair and the information that Mr. Kang would be 2 minutes. He was 90 seconds. She heard him before she saw him, which was not how she'd expected it. Not his voice and the change in the room. The two assistants near the far wall straightened almost imperceptibly. Yuna, who had been reviewing something on a tablet, turned toward the door with an alertness that was not quite deference, but was close to it. The air in the room seemed to recalibrate. Then he walked in. Kang Jae-won was tall in the way that seemed less about height and more about the specific quality of how he occupied space, completely, without apology, without awareness that he was doing it. Dark suit, no tie, the collar of his shirt open by a single button, in a way that read less casual than deliberate. His jaw was set with the stillness of someone who had long ago stopped reacting to things in real time. A faint scar ran along the left side of his chin, pale against his skin, thin as a thread. His hair was dark and pushed back from his face. His eyes found her immediately. They were darker than she'd expected and entirely unreadable, and they stayed on her face for 3 full seconds, with the quality of someone reading a document they'd already reviewed once and were now checking for discrepancies. Then he sat down across from her, set a folder on the table between them, and said, "You redesigned the load-bearing structure on Sable Pier 3 weeks before deadline without losing a single day of the original timeline." It wasn't a compliment, it was a statement of fact. It was, she realized, also a test. "The original design had a flaw," she said. "I found it. Fixing it was the job." Something shifted almost invisibly at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, an acknowledgement. "Holt took the award me," he said. "Holt signed the contract," she said. "I did the work." He looked at her for another moment. Then he opened the folder. The project was called Serin Tower. 47 stories mixed use to be built on a parcel of land in Hudson Yards that J Group had acquired 18 months ago and had, according to the single-page brief he slid toward her, failed to begin construction on due to a design that Kang Jae-won had rejected twice. 2 firms, he said, both of them respected, both of them wrong. Nora looked at the rejected renderings. She understood immediately what was wrong with them. They were technically proficient and emotionally inert, buildings that answered the brief but asked no questions of the city around them. She kept her expression neutral. "What's the 3rd floor constraint?" she asked. He paused, a fraction of a second. "Most people ask about the budget first." "Most people aren't architects." She looked up. "The parcel has a setback issue on the Hudson-facing side. The 2 rejected designs both ignored it. I want to know what your constraint is on the 3rd floor before I look at anything else." Jae-won was quiet for a moment. Then he told her. She asked 4 more questions. He answered each one without elaboration, which she appreciated more than she expected to. They spent 11 minutes on the project, and in those 11 minutes she understood what he needed and why no one had given it to him yet, and she felt, beneath the exhaustion and the financial terror and the weight of the past 8 months, something she'd been afraid was gone. The clean, focused pull of a problem worth solving. Then he closed his folder. "There's a second element to this arrangement," he said. Nora set down her pen. He explained it without preamble. J Group was in the final stages of a development partnership with Cheon Industries, a South Korean conglomerate whose chairman, Park Sung-il, was 73 years old and conducted all major business negotiations according to a set of values that were, in Jae-won's words, traditional in ways that are inconvenient but not negotiable. Chairman Park had expressed twice that he was uncomfortable entering a long-term partnership with an unmarried man of Jae-won's age and profile. The 3rd meeting was in 6 weeks, in Seoul. And it was the meeting that would finalize or dissolve a $4 billion agreement. "I need someone to accompany me as my fiancé," Jae-won said, "for 6 weeks. 3 public events in New York, 1 week in Seoul. After the deal closes, the engagement is called off by mutual agreement for personal reasons, publicly and cleanly." Nora looked at him. "In exchange," he continued, and his voice carried the flat, precise tone of a man reading terms he had already decided were fair, "your design fees for Serin Tower will be paid in full upon signing. The advance alone covers the cost of your mother's procedure." The room was very quiet. He had known about her mother. He had known the number. She felt the particular cold that comes not from cruelty, but from the realization that someone has done their research carefully and completely, and that they have chosen to use that information not as leverage in a cruel sense, but as precision, cutting directly to the point so that neither of them had to spend time on things that didn't matter. She wasn't sure yet whether that made it better or worse. "You've had me looked into," she said. "I research everyone I work with. This is more than a work arrangement, which is why the research was more thorough." He held her gaze. "I don't do this carelessly, Ms. Ellis. I need someone intelligent enough to hold a conversation in a room full of people who are testing her, professional enough to maintain the arrangement without complication, and confident enough not to be erased by the environment. And you chose me. Your work speaks for the intelligence. The way you handled this morning speaks for the rest." Nora was quiet for a moment. Her hands were still in her lap. On her right side, the city moved 30 stories below the window. "I have a condition," she said. He waited. "If at any point this arrangement requires something that compromises my professional reputation or my personal integrity, I walk. No penalties, no clauses, no complications. I walk." He looked at her for 3 seconds. The muscle at the side of his jaw was still. "And the hearing aid," she said, her voice even. "I wear it to every event. It's not a point of discussion." Something passed through his expression, not pity, which she'd been bracing for. Something quieter, a form of acknowledgement that didn't require comment. "Agreed," he said. He pushed the contract across the table. She signed it. The first week was a study in professional distance maintained with precision. Jae-won was efficient. He communicated through Yuna in most instances, reserved direct contact for Serin Tower design reviews, and when they appeared together at the first public event, a charity gala for a children's hospital announced quietly in the social pages the following morning, he was physically present and entirely unreachable, standing close enough to make the arrangement credible, and far enough that she felt the careful, deliberate maintenance of that distance like a temperature. He introduced her without flourish, kept a hand at the small of her back in the photographs, removed it the moment the cameras moved on, answered questions about their relationship with the measured delivery of a man who had prepared exactly what to say and saw no reason to deviate. She matched him. She was good at it. It turned out, the professional smile, the comfortable familiarity performed for an audience without bleeding into anything real. Her years of client presentations had prepared her for more than she'd realized. She could hold a room. She could be charming without being soft. She noticed he watched her from across the room twice. When she glanced back, he was already looking elsewhere. The design work was something else entirely. In the first review session, she came with a preliminary concept that reoriented the tower's facade in response to the setback issue. A subtle angular shift that resolved the proportion problem and created, as a consequence, a ground-level public space that the previous designs had sacrificed. She explained it in 6 minutes. He asked 2 questions. Both were good questions. She revised based on the second one, and the revision was better. He said, "Continue. Not good. Not impressive. Continue." As if the work was meeting a standard he had already decided it would meet, and the acknowledgement was simply the instruction to keep going. She told herself that was irritating. She thought about it on the subway home and admitted, in the privacy of her own mind, that it was actually the most useful feedback she'd received in 2 years. The complication arrived in week 3 in the form of Daniel Park. He was a developer, younger than Jae-won, louder, the kind of handsome that he was clearly aware of, and deployed with deliberate casualness. He appeared at the second public event, a gallery opening in Chelsea, and found Nora within 20 minutes of her arrival, at a moment when Jae-won had stepped away to take a call. "Nora Ellis," Daniel said, with the tone of someone who had already looked her up. "I heard you were working with Kang. I'm surprised he let you out of the office." "He's not in the habit of keeping people," she said pleasantly. Daniel smiled. He was charming in the way that people are when charm is a professional tool. "I've been following the Sable Pier project. The structural redesign was yours. It was a team effort. Marcus Holt doesn't have your eye, and everyone in the industry knows it." He tilted his head. "I have a project in Long Island City that's been through 2 architects. I'd love to show you the brief." He said it lightly, but it was not a light offer. It was the kind of thing that a year ago would have been exactly what she needed. She was aware of that, and she was aware that he knew she was aware of it. "Send it to my office," she said. "I'd rather take you to dinner." She smiled. "Send it to my office." She turned back toward the gallery, and Jae-won was there. She didn't know how long he'd been there. His expression was the same as it always was, composed, unreadable, the jaw set with that particular stillness. But his eyes moved from her face to Daniel Park's retreating back, and something in them was different, a quality she hadn't seen before, not cold, something underneath the cold, pressing against it. "He has a project," she said, because it seemed necessary to say. "I know what he has," Jae-won said. His voice was the same as always, but the hand he placed at her back when a photographer appeared was not the careful, deliberate gesture from the first event. It was different, slightly closer, the pressure more present. She felt it through the fabric of her dress and told herself it meant nothing. He didn't mention Daniel Park for the rest of the evening, but she caught him looking at her 3 more times, and each time he looked away a half-second later than he had before. The Seoul trip was announced with 2 weeks' notice, a detailed itinerary from Yuna, and a card from Jae-won's tailor with an appointment time and the brief impersonal note. "The wardrobe requirements for the chairman's events are specific. Yuna can explain," Yuna explained. Chairman Park's world was formal, traditional, and attentive to presentation in the way of someone who believed that how a person appeared in public was a direct expression of their interior values. Nora listened, adapted, and spent an afternoon in the tailor's studio, being fitted for 3 outfits she would wear for exactly 1 week and possibly never again. She didn't complain. She had grown up watching her mother stretch a household budget into geometries it wasn't designed for. This was temporary, the end was visible, and the number in her bank account from the advance payment had already cleared Mercy General's invoice. Her mother's surgery was scheduled for the week she'd be in Seoul. She sat with that for a night. The surgery would go fine. The doctors were clear on the prognosis. The procedure was standard for someone of her mother's health and age. The risk was low, but she would not be there. She would be on the other side of the world, in a role constructed for someone else's convenience, while the woman who had raised her alone and never asked for anything went under anesthesia without her daughter's hand to hold. She didn't tell Jae-won. It wasn't his concern. What she didn't know was that Yuna was monitoring her mother's hospital updates at Jae-won's quiet instruction. She wouldn't know that until later. Seoul was overwhelming in the way of places that are simultaneously vast and precise, a city that moved fast but moved exactly, with none of the beautiful chaos she associated with New York. The hotel suite was 2 rooms, separated by a living area, and Jae-won was already on a call when she arrived, standing at the window with his jacket off and his back to the room, speaking in Korean in a voice she had not heard before, lower, faster, with an undertone that was not quite anger, but was adjacent to it. He turned when she came in. The call ended 30 seconds later. "How was the flight?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "What was that about?" He looked at her. The question was too direct for their arrangement. They didn't ask each other things like that. He had established the terms of their interaction through 10 weeks of precise, professional distance, and she had maintained them without difficulty. But she was tired from the flight and worried about her mother, and the word fine had cost her more than it usually did. And she was apparently beyond the point of curating her directness for his comfort. "A contract negotiation that is becoming complicated," he said. "Not Cheon. No, something else." He paused. "It will be resolved." He said it with the certainty of someone who had never encountered a problem, that couldn't be resolved through sufficient application of will and resources. She found it annoying, and at a frequency she was careful not to examine, vaguely reassuring. "The chairman's dinner is at 8, he said. "Una has the details." He moved toward his room. She was already crossing to hers. "Jae-won," she said. He stopped. She almost never used his name directly. In 10 weeks, she could count the instances on one hand. "Thank you," she said, "for the surgery." The advance. He was still for a moment. His back was to her. "It was part of the arrangement," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm thanking you anyway." He didn't answer, but he stood there for 3 seconds longer than necessary before walking to his room, and the slight tension across his shoulders was different from the tension she'd learned to read as composure. She filed it away and went to get dressed. Chairman Park was 73 and smaller than she'd expected, with the quality of someone who had spent decades ensuring that his diminutive frame created no impression of diminishment. He looked at Nora for a long moment when they were introduced, with the frank, evaluating gaze of a man who had made his fortune reading people correctly and saw no reason to disguise the process. Then he smiled. A real one. "She has steady eyes," he said to Jae-won in Korean, and Jae-won translated without expression. "He says you have a strong presence." She suspected that wasn't quite what he'd said, but she smiled at the chairman and said, "Please tell him I've been told I'm difficult to read. I'll consider it a compliment." Chairman Park laughed, the surprised, genuine kind. He spoke again. Jae-won translated, "He says he likes that." Over dinner, she was seated between the chairman's daughter and a vice president of Cheon Industries who wanted to discuss American architecture with an enthusiasm that was entirely genuine and slightly breathless. She answered him directly, without performed modesty, and he pulled his chair slightly closer within 15 minutes. Across the table, she caught Jae-won watching her. He raised his water glass. A fraction of an inch. She didn't know what it meant. She raised hers back, which seemed like the appropriate response, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way she had come to associate with the closest he came to a genuine smile. Later, walking back through the hotel lobby, he said, "The vice president asked if you'd be interested in consulting on a cultural center they're developing in Incheon." "I know," she said. "He gave me his card." Jae-won glanced at her. "You didn't mention it." "It just happened." "Are you considering it?" She looked at him. "Does it matter for the arrangement?" He was quiet for a moment. The elevator doors opened. "No," he said. But the word had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Something careful about it. Something that suggested it wasn't entirely the truth. The problem arrived on the 4th day in Seoul, in the form of a woman named Jung Hana. She appeared at the afternoon event, a reception at the Cheon Industries headquarters, with the particular composure of someone who was accustomed to being noticed and had decided, on this specific occasion, to use it. She was beautiful in a deliberately presented way, her smile for Jae-won carrying a warmth that had history in it, and she crossed the room toward him with the ease of someone who had done it many times before. Nora was speaking to the chairman's daughter when it happened. She didn't look away from her conversation. She laughed at something the younger woman said, touched her arm briefly and kept her posture easy. But she was acutely aware of where Jae-won was in the room, of the fact that Jung Hana was speaking to him now, close and familiar, and that she had placed one hand briefly on his arm with the natural ease of a prior claim. She felt something move through her that she had no prepared language for. She reached for annoyance, which was the appropriate emotion for a professional arrangement experiencing interference, and found something more inconvenient underneath it. She had no right to it. She knew that clearly, and she pressed it down, kept her smile in place, and finished her conversation. When she and Jae-won were briefly alone near the far end of the room, she said lightly, "Old friend." "Former colleague," he said. "She seems fond of you." He glanced at her. His expression was, as always, composed, but there was something beneath the surface of it, a tension that he was containing with the careful effort of someone who didn't want it observed. "It was some time ago," he said. "You don't owe me explanations," she said. "It's not that kind of arrangement." "No," he he agreed, and then after a pause that lasted slightly longer than it needed to, "It is not." She nodded, looked away. They didn't speak again for 40 minutes. When she glanced at him from across the room, he was not looking at Jung Hana. He was looking at her. She found the photograph by accident. On the 5th night, she had come back from a late dinner with the chairman's family. Jae-won had stayed behind for a separate meeting, and she was crossing the suite's shared living area when she noticed that his work bag was open on the table, its contents partially spilled in what was, for him, a remarkable display of disorder. She went to push it aside and a folder slid out. The folder held printed documentation. She glanced away, not her business. But a smaller photograph had come loose, and she picked it up to replace it without looking. And then she looked. It was a print of the Sable Pier building. Her Sable Pier. The final design photographed at dusk, the steel structure catching the last of the light. In the margin, in handwriting that was precise and minimal, someone had written a date, 6 months ago before any of this, and beneath it, her name. Just her name, Nora Ellis, underlined once. She stood there for a moment. The suite was quiet. The Seoul skyline made a faint, constant glow at the windows. He had been looking at her work before he'd reached out, before the arrangement, before any of this. He had found her, specifically, from a building that no one had publicly credited her for, which meant he had done research that went beyond a professional database. She put the photograph back, closed the folder, left the table exactly as it was. She sat down on the couch and looked at the window for a long time. When Jae-won came in an hour later, she was in her room, and she heard him stop in the living area and stand there for a moment. She could tell by the quality of the silence, and then move toward his own room. Neither of them slept well that night. She knew because at 2 in the morning she was still awake, and the light beneath his door had not gone out. The final day in Seoul went wrong at 11 in the morning. It was a smaller gathering, a tea with Chairman Park and 4 senior members of Cheon Industries, the kind of meeting that was structured as social, but was, in fact, the real evaluation. Nora had been calm. She had been prepared. She had worn the dark dress that the tailor had deemed appropriate for morning formality, and had her hearing aid in, and her posture exactly right. And then the chairman's eldest son, who had been quiet for most of the gathering, said something in Korean that made 2 people at the table go very still. Jae-won's jaw tightened. Nora looked at him. He translated a moment later, his voice even. He's asking whether an American architect with a disability would be an appropriate partner for a long-term development relationship. The room was very still. The word sat in the air with the particular weight of something that had been chosen carefully for its cruelty. Nora set down her teacup. She looked directly at the chairman's son, and she said, with the absolute calm of someone who had been answering this question for 2 years in 100 different forms, "I designed the Sable Pier renovation under deadline, under pressure, and under conditions that most architects don't survive professionally. I did it with exactly the hearing I have now. If the question is whether I can produce exceptional work, the answer is in the building. You're welcome to visit it." Silence. Chairman Park made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He said something to his son, in a tone that made the son look briefly at the tablecloth. Jae-won translated for her. He says he raised his son to evaluate results, not rumors. He apologizes for the question. Nora nodded at the chairman, picked up her teacup, continued the conversation. Jae-won didn't look at her directly, but his hand, which had been resting on the table 2 inches from hers, moved 1 inch closer. She pretended not to notice. They were in the car to the airport when he said, without looking away from the window, "You didn't need me to say anything." "No," she said. "You weren't waiting for me to intervene." "I haven't waited for anyone to intervene in about 20 years. A pause. "The son will not be an issue," Jae-won said. "I spoke to the chairman afterward." She turned to look at him. His profile was toward the window, the clean line of his jaw, the specific angle of his shoulders. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. Another pause, longer this time. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, barely perceptibly, and turned back to the window. But something in the line of his shoulders had changed, a quality she had no name for. Like a wall that was still standing but had shifted slightly on its foundation, they came back to New York on a Thursday. By Saturday, the deal was signed. Chairman Park had called Jae-won personally to express his approval of the project, of the partnership, of the woman at his side who had, in the chairman's assessment, the kind of spine that keeps a man honest. Jae-won relayed this to her over the phone. His voice was neutral. She heard something under the neutrality that she had started to recognize. "So the arrangement is concluded," she said. A pause, 2 beats too long. "There is a closing clause," he said. "A public announcement. The engagement ends publicly in 2 weeks to give the coverage time to cycle." "I know," she said. "It's in the contract." "Yes." Another pause. "Nora," he said. It was the first time he had ever said her name like that, without the professional framing, without the buffer of the arrangement holding the vowels in place. Her name, in his voice, at whatever hour it was in the Saturday morning quiet of her apartment, landed differently than any previous version of her name had ever landed. She waited. "How is your mother?" he said. She exhaled slowly. "She's good. The surgery went well. She's home, recovering." "I know," he said. Yuna was tracking the updates. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the photograph in the folder, the underlined name, the 2 inches that had become 1 inch on the table in Seoul, the hallway at 2 in the morning when she was 90% certain she had heard him stop outside her door. "Were you always going to tell me that?" she asked. "No," he said after a moment. "I was going to let you think it was purely a professional arrangement and say nothing that complicated the terms." "What changed?" Silence. "You did," he said. "You kept changing things I had decided were fixed." She didn't see him for 5 days after that. The days had a specific quality, not quite emptiness, because she was working. The Serin Tower designs were deepening into something she was genuinely proud of, and her mother was calling every afternoon from her recovery with the bright, cheerful updates of someone grateful to be alive and determined to fill silence with noise. But something was different about the apartment. A dimension she hadn't noticed was missing until it was. She didn't examine it too carefully. She knew what it was. She called Yuna to confirm the timeline for the public announcement, walked through the language with her practical, unshowy precision, and signed off on the drafted statement without reading it 3 times the way she would have read a contract. She was folding the statement into its envelope when her phone rang. Jae-won's name on the screen. She picked up. "Come to the office," he said. "The announcement is handled. Yuna has everything." "This is not about the announcement." She was quiet. "Come to the office," he said again, and his voice had the quality of a man who had spent 5 days deciding something and had reached the end of his deciding. The 41st floor was quiet when she arrived. It was early evening, the sky behind the floor-to-ceiling windows moving from grey gold towards something deeper, the city below already beginning to light itself. Most of the staff was gone. Yuna was at her desk and looked up when Nora came through, and something in Yuna's carefully professional expression contained, Nora thought, the ghost of a look she chose not to interrogate. Jae-won was at the window. His jacket was off. He was standing the way he stood when he was working through something, which she had come to recognize. Weight slightly forward, one hand in his pocket, the particular quality of stillness that was not rest but concentration. He turned when she came in. She stopped a few feet from him and waited. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, a plane crossed the horizon, trailing its small moving light. "The contract terminates in 9 days, he said. "I know." "The design work continues. That's a separate arrangement. It's unaffected." "I know that too." "But the arrangement—" He stopped. A muscle moved along his jaw. He looked briefly away, then back. "I have been trying to find the precise language for what I want to say, which is not a difficulty I typically encounter." She said nothing. The light in the room was warm and specific. "I had criteria," he said, "for this. Very clear criteria. I needed someone intelligent and capable and discreet, and I found that in your work before I found it in you, and I told myself that the arrangement would be exactly what it was described as, And I... He stopped again. His hand came out of his pocket. I was wrong. About which part? She asked quietly. About the part where it stays an arrangement. His voice was lower than she'd heard it. Not soft. J1 was constitutionally incapable of soft, but stripped of the professional casing. The thing underneath it was not gentle. It was certain and serious, and it had the quality of something that had been contained for a long time under pressure, and could no longer be contained without cost. About the part where I stopped thinking about what you said to Chairman Park's son, and the way you looked at the Sable Pier photograph the morning I showed you the project, you recognized it before I told you what it was. About the part where I walked past your office and the light is still on and I... He stopped. You stop, she said. He looked at her. At 2 in the morning, she said, outside my door, in Seoul. I heard you. His jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. This was supposed to be a contract, he said. 6 weeks. Clean terms. Clear exit. His voice dropped further. It was never supposed to be you. The room was very quiet. Nora looked at him, at the composed, impenetrable man who had spent 10 weeks demonstrating every day that he needed nothing. He did. And had spent those same 10 weeks tracking her mother's surgical updates and keeping a photograph of her work in a folder and stopping in hallways in the middle of the night for reasons neither of them had spoken aloud. I found your name before I reached out, she said. You wrote it under the building. I saw it. Something moved through his expression, not surprise, a kind of relief, which looked on him like a door opening that had been sealed for a long time. You weren't supposed to see that, he said. I know. She took a step closer. J1, I'm not easy. I'm not going to become less difficult. I have strong opinions about structure, and I will argue with you about the tower design until we get it right, and I am very attached to my hearing aid and my independence, and the fact that no one in my life has ever been allowed to fix things for me without my knowledge. I'm aware, he said, and you looked up my work 6 months before you had any reason to contact me. Yes, and you sat outside a door in Seoul at 2 in the morning because you wanted to make sure I was all right. A pause. It seemed sufficient at the time. She was close now, close enough to see the slight, involuntary tension in his shoulders, the way his hand had moved toward her and then stilled. It was, she said. It was more than sufficient. He looked at her for a long moment, the full, reading look she'd grown accustomed to, but different now. No longer the look of someone checking for discrepancies. The look of someone who had found what he was looking for and had no more use for the pretense that he hadn't. His hand came up and he tucked a strand of hair back from her face, the gesture careful and deliberate, as if it was something he had considered for a long time and was now performing exactly as he had intended. The contract, she said. The contract ends today, he said. I'll file the closing documentation tomorrow. A pause, and something in his eyes changed. The faintest, rarest warmth. The kind she'd seen precisely twice before, and only in moments when he thought no one was watching. What comes after it is not a contract. She held his gaze. Good, she said. I have conditions for that too. His mouth moved, and this time, finally, fully, in the warm, specific light of a city going golden below them, he smiled. It was not the half-movement she'd catalogued over 10 weeks. It was real. It changed his face entirely, the way a room changes when someone opens a window in it, and she understood in that moment why it was rare, because it was devastating, and if he smiled like that with any regularity, the world would have a difficult time recovering. He kissed her softly first and then not softly, his hands in her hair, and the skyline moved below them in its indifferent, brilliant way, and the contract on Yuna's desk was already obsolete. The public announcement was brief and gracious. The response from the press was sympathetic and mild. Within 2 weeks, it had cycled through the gossip columns and into the category of things that had already happened. What the gossip columns did not note because no one had told them, that the woman in the photograph, the former fiancé who had taken the arrangement to Seoul and back, was still in the building at 7:30 most mornings. That her name was now on the Serin Tower project as lead architect, in writing, on the official documents, where it would remain through completion. that she had argued Jae-won into 3 significant structural changes and had been correct about all of them, which he had acknowledged in his precise economical way. Once, over coffee with the words, "You were right," which was, she had learned, a sentence he did not produce easily and meant everything when he did. Her mother recovered fully. She came to New York in the spring and walked through the Sable Pier site because Nora had finally told her the full story. And she stood at the waterfront and looked at the building her daughter had saved and said nothing for a long time. Then, "The man who found that building before he found you. I'd like to meet him." She met him that Sunday. He arrived with quiet punctuality, shook her hand and said very little, which her mother had expected. But over dinner he asked 3 questions about her recovery, specific questions, the kind that required research to formulate. And Patricia Ellis, who had raised her daughter alone for 28 years and knew exactly what a man who cared looked like when he thought no one was looking, sat back and smiled into her wine. Nora, across the table, caught her mother's expression. She shook her head slightly. Her mother smiled wider. Jae-won, who missed very little, looked between them. His jaw moved. "What?" he said, in the tone of a man who was not accustomed to being the last to understand something. "Nothing," Nora said. Under the table, his hand found hers. The tower broke ground in October. On the morning of the ceremony, Jae-won stood at the edge of the site in the particular autumn light of the city, clear and cold and precise, the kind of morning that made the buildings look like they were paying attention, and watched her walk the perimeter with the site engineer, pointing at something in the ground plan, her voice carrying across the noise of the equipment with the focused, unignorable quality that he had identified 6 months before any of this began, as exactly the kind of mind he had been looking for. He had been looking for an architect. He had found, in the coldest season of a year that had already cost her everything, the only person who had ever made him stop outside a door at 2 in the morning, for the simple, sufficient reason that she was on the other side of it. She looked up from the blueprint and found him watching. She had signed the contract to save her family. She had never expected to find, in the most unreadable man she'd ever known, the one person in the world who saw her, every specific, difficult, precise and irreducible part of her, and had underlined her name. She raised an eyebrow. He raised one back. She crossed the site toward him, blueprint still in hand, dirt on her boots, the city behind her doing exactly what cities do, moving forward, building upward, becoming what it was designed to become. He held out his hand. She took it.